It's been a long time since this channel has uploaded anything. We're sorry about that. We all have been busy with transitioning into college and routine. This video is specifically about the book I've read in the last couple of weeks. It's a classic book. It's called Crime and Punishment by the famous Russian author, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Probably mispronounced his name since he's a Russian dude, but I'll try my best. This isn't just a book review or some essay on the book. And don't worry, there are no spoilers in this. This will be a 3-video series. And the first one is about Raskolnikov's theory of what a crime looks like in the society. Let's start with Raskolnikov's theory on crime. In brief, without giving too much, I'll give a summary of what happens in the book. Our main character, Raskolnikov, commits a crime to test a certain theory of his. The crime committed is the killing of 2 sisters, one being the landlady and the other being the landlady's sister, followed by the act of stealing a couple thousand rubles worth of gold and jewelry. The book goes on to showcase the journey of a murderer and his interaction with his guilt and psychological feelings. But let's start by discussing why Raskolnikov goes on to commit the crime. Let's go in depth for his theory. Raskolnikov's theory is that people are categorized into ordinary and extraordinary living beings. People like Napoleon and other historical leaders fit the role of extraordinary people and are far more rare in the society. They take on tasks that are way more riskier, but turn out to be done for the greater good of the community. They are able to commit crimes without burdening their own conscience and good heart. That is, they have an inner right to commit crimes for the good sake. While the other people all seem to fit in the role of ordinary men who go on about their lives following rules and regulations and never seeking to find anything above, he adds that anyone who commits crime, anyone who comes in the way of an extraordinary citizen about to commit his crime, which in itself is not a crime but an act of valor and heroism, the extraordinary man has the power and the right to finish them off. In Raskolnikov's words, the ordinary preserve the world and cause it to multiply, while the extraordinary men move the world and lead it to its goal. This means that the ordinary men multiply amongst themselves to do the common work, while the extraordinary men go on to move and adjust the current paradigms of justice and law in order to reach a higher set point of law. They are able to do this, and only they can do this, because their conscience is strong enough to commit a crime without feeling any guilt. The ordinary men cannot transgress, as they are too weak, and can never convince their own conscience to do something so horrible, yet so necessary. A major point in this theory is that the extraordinary people are the ones who are able to transgress the law. They are not only excused from it, but are able to rise above it, and form a new platform with a higher sense of justice. In this manner, the ordinary men are more likely to be conservative, who constantly push for their old and traditional values, while the extraordinary men are liberal in a sense, and they are able to find ways to break through their old laws and jurisdictions. With this in mind, Raskolnikov ventures off to kill the old hag, the pawnbroker, the landlady, because he wants to see if he's an extraordinary living being. The old lady herself has grown out of her age, and has tons of money that is meant to go to the nunnery after she dies. Raskolnikov, in his moral conviction, agrees that neither the lady nor the nunnery needs any money. As he does need the money, and thus it is ethical in a way for him to use it for his career. After all, he isn't using the money in legal means, but just using it for his education. These may serve as defense mechanisms to use psychologically in order to convince oneself of doing a peculiar action at will. What is more interesting, however, is that Raskolnikov, though having a moral jurisdiction in his mind, does not seek the money for the least. In fact, he never uses it after he steals it. What Raskolnikov so craves for is the inner power of being an extraordinary individual. He wants to see if he can transgress, if he can have the courage to grow beyond his immature state. He wants to see if he can become a Napoleon, who shredded blood, so much blood, in order to secure a better empire. What he seeks is not money, nor any sort of fame, but rather simply a reason to exist, in other words. And it seems that apparent that our main character cannot fall asleep, or eat, or think properly before committing the crime. Our main character has convulsively started to prepare for his crime, to bring upon the axe, the coat, and strong will of killing. All this in the state of convulsion and confusion. Dostoevsky, the author, keeps bringing up Raskolnikov to question himself, to question what he is doing, and to question his morality and rationality. But it seems Raskolnikov has no control over his actions. Perhaps his theory has gone into his unconscious self and become a goal of his. As Sartre puts it, existence precedes essence, and thus our fellow who is about to commit a crime is viewing the crime as a need to exist. It is no longer merely an act, but rather an act that he must do. He must do it, or else he cannot think, he cannot sleep, he cannot exist. To all the nihilists and those existentialists out there, this sums up the character's will to rise above himself. As Nietzsche puts it, our true self is not within us, but higher than us. All people are trying to do something absurd, something vile, and something abnormal to ensure their existence isn't just ordinary. This line that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary gives Raskolnikov the courage to commit his unthinkable crime. Had he not thought about it before? Oh no, for sure he thought about it for days. It was the only thing he thought about, whether to kill or not. And his conclusion surely wasn't just convulsive. It was driven by psychological states of delirium and hallucinations as well. This was no longer an experiment. He wasn't just going there to see if he was able to do something out of his mind, but it was a purely planned event that he had no control over, but in some sense also did have control over, as he was able to stop himself if he had said that the theory was incorrect. But it appeared that the theory had gotten into his mind and he no longer could stop himself. Perhaps it was a need to exist, a need to power, a will to power. It seems Dostoevsky brings this sense of evil possession in Raskolnikov, but Nietzsche wouldn't call it evil. He would just call it absurd and necessary. Raskolnikov realizes that his rationality has been eaten up by this evil possession of his, and evil has existed not in his character, but in his actions, his motives, and his thoughts. He had given rise to evil, and the evil had given rise to his new self, perhaps the extraordinary self, as he puts it. But was it purely evil? And why is evil not as good as good? Wasn't there a clear thought behind his action? He just wanted to see if he could transgress. One life surely isn't that big of a deal, right? And if he was successful in the act of killing, he may have gone on to do greater things in seek of confidence of his extraordinary self. After all, he was killing an old lady who overcharged her customers and was always rude to them. He was to put her off for the greater good, as one would say, and certainly from a utilitarian perspective, it seems right. And even in his theory, the deontological self, the dutiful self, would also agree, because it seems no one else were to do the crime. It was only his duty to kill the unnecessary ones. And only he had to do it. All the others were the ordinary men. No, he wasn't like them. He wasn't like the rest of them, who cursed at their failures and accepted the injustice in the world. Raskolnikov was an intellectual, a law student, with the ability to do the crime and deem himself as one above the others. The power, the self-fulfillment he would achieve after the act would surely be worth it, right? Well, it wasn't really about the worth. It was just about doing it. It was about feeling alive, as he would call it. It didn't turn out that way. He failed, as he realized that he was no Napoleon after all. That unlike the other historical leaders, he couldn't convince his conscience to accept his evil deeds. He had committed the crime, and just the next day he had fallen to sickness. He wasn't strong enough, he thought. Maybe he was just an ordinary individual trying really hard to be an extraordinary person. But the fact is that unlike the others, he wasn't able to move on with his life. He just couldn't convince his moral self that his life was worth living. What is more funny is that the only thing he wanted to do before was to commit crime, to feel alive, and the only thing now he could think of was only if he couldn't have committed the crime. It is ironic in a sense that Raskolnikov felt alive while doing the crime, but now feels as if his life is unworthy because of the crime. But again, he isn't really guilty. He just doesn't understand why the society can't accept it. He never until the end felt he was at blame for the crime. Yet his psychological self did not showcase his determination, as he always felt pale and delirious when police officers and all those who talked about him expected him to be a suspect. Perhaps it was the society's pressure, like I said, that got to him. After all, he wanted to transgress the law, and if he wanted to do that, he had to do it in a way that people would accept him and his actions. Was it just a society who was not competent enough to understand Raskolnikov's theory and his actions? And was this the fact that perhaps caused him to be so delirious all the time? Who knows? The book suggests that the crime had ended with punishment, and not the legal punishment of that sort, but an internal punishment, the kind of punishment one cannot get rid of, the eternal feeling of being a criminal. Maybe it's a psychological punishment. Maybe it was a punishment given by God. Being a sinner in the eyes of God surely wasn't a good thing, as Raskolnikov figured it out later. Dostoevsky puts a great effort into the theocratic part of it, as he suggests that God surely God surely sees people through another eye when they commit a sin, and that God will surely punish them for their crimes. So Raskolnikov's little theory of transgression had, if anything, degraded his moral self-esteem. He no longer felt like human, let alone a hero like Napoleon. This theory in short had failed him. Maybe he was destined to fail it to begin with. But Raskolnikov couldn't convince himself to be an extraordinary person. He couldn't find the higher self, a self that was not bounded by social norms and predispositions, rather a self that was able to free itself, and use this freedom to find higher levels of power. No, but alas, he had failed. His theory may have been right, but he surely was no extraordinary, as he just couldn't find the higher self. If he had found it, he wouldn't have given himself in. The section ends here, and there are 3 parts of series that will lead up to this section. The next part will analyze the psychological behavior of the criminal's mind. I'll go in depth about how Raskolnikov, like all criminals, seeked comfort and discomfort, and how his life simply became a burden. I'll end with Dostoevsky's quote that summarizes Raskolnikov's theory in short. The mystery of a human existence is not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. Until next time.